Hello students. So we are going to do some still life drawing. And what I'd like you to do is pick 3 objects that are in different sizes and then arrange them together so that they're overlapping a little bit. And I'll show you kind of what I mean here in just a second. So these are my 3 objects that I picked. I tried to pick things that I thought most people might have around their home. So something from the pantry, a vegetable or fruit, and then like a mug or a cup. If you have cooler objects, then by all means use some cooler objects that you have. I was just trying to keep it fairly simple and realistic for what we might have at our houses. But what I want you to notice is we have 3 different heights, right? So try to pick objects that are 3 different heights so we have this natural kind of step. It makes for a more interesting and dynamic drawing and a composition when it's like that. Secondly, try to pick things that maybe have a few different types of shapes that are going on. These 2 are pretty similar in terms of like being cylinders, but because of their color difference and texture difference, I thought they'd work well. And then of course this is kind of a rounded shape. All right, last thing. So 3 things that are different heights, kind of different textures and personalities, you might say. And then the last thing is consider lighting. Right now I have these fluorescent lights on above me. But I also have this light coming to the side. You can see as I put my hand here, it's casting a shadow, and it's creating these cast shadows off here. So it would be ideal if you can have a light source that's kind of on one side of your objects instead of it just being lit like from straight down. Again, it's not like right or wrong. It's just, it makes for a more dynamic drawing, and you can see the shadows a little bit better if you have one light source instead of having it be like completely lit from up above. Ideally, you would be drawing by looking at your objects, and you'll notice there'll be some like kind of interesting things where if you close one eye and then the other eye, one object might bounce a little bit where they overlap. And that's actually good practice because you're going to have to make some choices as an artist about what you want to follow. Where do you want those lines to intersect or overlap? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So normally when you do a still life, you'd be looking at the objects, but because we're doing a video, a tutorial video, that is, I have printed off a picture of it so that I can point things out to you as I'm going. So before we get going, there's 3 things I want you to remember as we draw our still lives, is always checking your size relationships. That basically means what's the relationship between this object and this object in terms of size, and between this object in terms of size. Overlapping. So where do each of these objects overlap with one another? That'll help you get things right. And then shading or contour lines, which we'll talk about in a minute. Contour lines basically just means like outlines. And then shading, we've talked about before, where you go from light to dark and do all the shadows. So let's get started. So it's always good maybe to give yourself a sense of scale of how big are you going to draw your drawing. So since this is kind of like the largest object here, I'm going to just start by establishing where do I think the top of this object's going to be, and then where do I think the bottom is going to be, and you're just kind of eyeballing it here. But again, you'd be looking at your objects. I have this picture here just so you can see what I'm doing at the same time. I don't have a fancy enough setup to have both going 2 cameras at once. So this is going to be the top and bottom of my first object. So pick your biggest object and try to figure out, okay, where's the top and bottom going to be? And don't worry about getting all the details in yet. What we're going to try and do is just get the general shapes in. So let's just turn this jar into a rectangle for now. Say it's a rectangle that's going to occupy about that much space on my page. And so now let's try to get these other 2 objects in here. This onion's right in front, so I'm going to go ahead and do that one next. And we've kind of got this nice round shape. And what I want to think about is, where does it overlap on my jar? Is it halfway between the top and bottom? Or is it more of like a quarter of the way from the bottom? And once you kind of figure that out by looking at your objects, you're going to make a little mark there. And then how far down below my jar does it come? It comes, let's see, if this is about halfway, it kind of comes down a little bit more than half of the onion. So if this is half, the other half would be here, and the bottom of the onion would be around here. But guess what? No one's gonna know your objects. So this is kind of nice when you do still lives, because you just do your best, but no one else is gonna be looking at what you're looking at and comparing. So you kind of have the the freedom to make some artistic changes or choices, and if it's not exact, no one's gonna know. Okay, so I got the general shape of the onion in there. And then I'm gonna draw my cup, and there's a little gap here between the jar and the cup, so I'm gonna recognize that. It comes over like this, and then my mug or my cup doesn't quite touch here, so it comes over, and again, I'm just simplifying this into kind of a rectangle to figure out it overlaps right here on my onion, right underneath that part where it curves up to the kind of like the stalk of the onion, I suppose. All right, and then we kind of got this handle over here. So start simple. Break it down into basic shapes. We've got a rectangle, kind of an ovally shape, and another rectangle over here. And now we can start to work in some of the other details. So the first thing we just did right there was size relationships and overlapping. We used those two tools to compare the sizes and the where they overlap one another to kind of get the general composition down. So now let's talk about putting in some details. It's really helpful to get the tops of these openings correct. So if you have anything that's round, you might have 3 different objects and this is irrelevant, but if you do have something that has sort of the top of a cylinder, you want to try and get that right. So for this one, for example, if I go like this and do a big round shape that looks more like a circle, that's not quite right, is it? Because it's at an angle, it's more of a squished, like oval shape. And if you draw it more like a circle, you're trying to show everybody that you're looking at it from a higher vantage point. Because, here, I'll grab my cup here. Even though we know a cup has a circle as an opening, as it's turned away from the viewer, you can see that metal ring is no longer a circle, is it? Visually, it's squishing down into a skinny little ellipsis or oval. So depending on how you draw things like that, those curves is going to trick the brain into seeing your object from a different vantage point. So it's very important that you get some of that stuff accurate. All right, so I'm going to redraw that because that's not quite right. Draw it light till you get it right. And then you can erase the lines that didn't work out. All right, and then we know that is kind of there's these 2 sides here. So we'll maybe start to draw on the top and bottom of that metal lid to my sauerkraut jar. I'm sure everybody has a big jar of sauerkraut in their pantry, right? Okay, there we go. Got that lid. And then I can see that underneath the lid, the glass it doesn't go right up to the edge of that metal, right? It cuts in a bit. So I'm going to use that knowledge of things I see right there to guide me on my drawing. And then it curves out at an angle. And again, no one knows the exact thing that you're drawing. So if you don't get those angles and curves just right, don't stress about it. This is an exercise. It's a skill builder, and we're just learning from this. All right, and I'm going to have these lines come down. And then on the bottom, there's a curve right here, and then there's a second curve. And you might not be able to see it very well in that picture, but I can see it. And again, getting those curves right is worth the time. So if you look at it again and think, it's not quite right, you can redo it. And then you can add some more realism by starting to work in some other little curves in here. Now, what I'm doing right now is called contour lines, right here. And some of you might spend 60 minutes on your drawing and only do contour lines and never quite get to shading. And that's okay, because contour lines are really important. And you can make a drawing without any shading and only contour lines and have it be really beautiful. So try, if you want to challenge yourself to get those contour lines right. And as I looked at this, I can see that those little ridges on the glass, they change direction. They angle like this, and then as they go around the jar, they start to angle like that. So be patient with yourself and try to force yourself to see those little teensy details. This is all about observation. It's a skill that artists and scientists use to improve their understanding of things. So, but it is a challenge. It takes a lot of practice to constantly be flipping back and forth between what you're drawing and what you're looking at. Try to look at your objects as much or more than your actual drawing. All right, and then there's that sticker comes down. I'm just going to do a quick little loose sketch here of the label. What is that star shape? It's right there. Okay. And then there's this nutrition facts. All right, so let's stop on that for now and get working on our contour lines for my onion here. Kind of already had this mostly, except for these little, like, the stalk kind of part that sort of dried up, this flaky part. But what I could do here for my contour lines is I could start to hint at where these shadows are and where this highlight is. So I could draw a little line right here. That's going to be my highlight. And there's these little subtle lines of the onion coming down. And again, I notice it as they go around the onion. It's hard to see in my picture. My real life onion, I can see that there's these little veins or lines of the onion running around it. And when they're up here, like kind of above the middle of it, they're kind of curving upwards. And then when they go in the middle, they're almost straight. And then when they curve down on the bottom part. So I have to change the directions of my lines depending on what side of the onion I'm drawing on. And then we kind of got this root part on the back here. Another contour line that I haven't drawn that I could draw is the shadow. So I can see where the shadow starts is about this part of my onion right here. And it curves and it kind of touches that, it kind of curves up to that part of my jar. So again, I'm kind of using overlapping and size relationships to help guide me on where these shadows should be. Yeah, that's good. All right, now let's get to this mug. And this mug, since it's lower, notice how I'm gonna mark up my picture now, but notice how this oval here is a little bit more squished looking than this one is gonna be wider. And that's because it's shorter. So my vantage point, the way I view it, is a little bit different. So again, noticing these details, these subtle changes to things is important for artists and scientists and lots of other content areas and specializations. It's important to be an observer of your world. Okay, so there's that, and then I have this. If this is the metal ring around my mug, I can see it cuts in a bit here. So that metal part pops away from the actual side of the mug on both sides. And then I need to have the bottom curve too. Generally, if you have a curve like right here, it's gonna match the bottom for the most part. So you could just try to be like copy, paste. If that makes sense. If what I just said doesn't make any sense, you can ignore it. All right. So I'm just working on getting my contour lines in here. Outline kind of lines to things. I've got this sort of shadow thing happening here. That metal ring would be fun to shade. I haven't gotten to that though. All right, now I need to do my mug's handle. So that curves out like this. Down and back in. I'm just constantly looking at what I'm drawing and then trying to draw on over here. Okay. Now, this is where you can get into some little artistic freedom. When you're looking at your objects, that way you try and observe and draw them as you see them. But when it comes to the background, if you've got a messy background, you don't like your background, you can do, just kind of keep it simple. And I think I'll do that for this one. I'll just pretend that this is sort of my table in the background. Let's give it a setting though. That helps a lot to kind of give it some sort of suggestion that it's sitting on something. Okay. I'll kind of finish in that shadow there. All right, so this right here, right now with this line here, it looks like a transparent onion, so I'm gonna get rid of that line. this right here, if this takes you like a total of 60 minutes to get to this part, then you can call it done. But if you're able to whip out a contour drawing like this pretty quickly from observation, you have some skills already built in, and it just flows and comes together, and you still got 30 minutes, I want you to try and work on some shading. So I think I'll go ahead and shade this, but I'll just do it in time-lapse form. All right, here's the finished drawing. And I wanted to just let you know that I used a 6B pencil and my mechanical pencil with the eraser. If you don't have a 6B pencil and all you have is a regular one, that's totally fine. But that's just what I use to help kind of build up those darker values quicker, because the 6B is pretty dark pencil. So there's more I could do to this. This was about 25 minutes of shading. But I just want you to notice that I did not try to include every single little detail on that label. I just tried to focus on the darks and the lights, mostly shadows and reflections. So you do the same thing. Don't get overwhelmed with all of the details and trying to draw like every little piece of cabbage inside there. Just try to focus on the general shadows and highlights and have fun with it. And again, if you spend 60 minutes and all you have is a contour drawing, that's totally fine. But if you got more time, try to put in some shading.